"Denied! Step aside! Now!" The words cracked like a rifle shot across the check-in counter, drawing every eye in the room. The man they were aimed at did not argue. His hand tightened around the handle of a battered leather range bag, the skin stretched thin and pale over his knuckles. His cap shadowed his face, but the set of his jaw betrayed the effort of holding steady. He stood, not pleading, not moving, simply standing. Across from him, the sergeant leaned forward, palm flat against the paperwork, eyes sharp with a kind of zeal that went beyond rules. His voice carried the hard edge of authority turned personal. "You're not cleared. I said move aside." A hush rippled down the line. Some shooters shifted uneasily, the weight of their cases pressed against their legs. Others avoided looking, their gazes fixed on the scuffed floor tiles. Two younger men near the back snickered. "Guess he wandered in from bingo night." The old man's shoulders lifted faintly, then settled. No protest, no retreat, only a slow, deliberate breath. His thumb stroked the cracked leather handle of the bag in his grip, a silent motion that kept him rooted. The sergeant barked again, sharper now, relishing the echo. "Now, don't make me repeat myself." The tension held the air still, muting even the distant rhythm of rifles firing on the open range beyond. A bead of sweat rolled down the old man's temple, catching the light before disappearing into the creases of his skin. From the far side of the room, boots shifted against the floor. A figure in combat uniform, tall and steady, turned his head, his gaze fixed on the standoff at the counter, eyes narrowing. His hands, resting on a folder of paperwork, stilled. The sergeant did not notice. The crowd watched without breathing. The old man refused to move, but someone else was watching. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The old man remained steady at the counter, the tension thick enough to choke the air. His name, Harold Benton, would not be known to the others yet, but the weight of his presence began to press against the silence. He was 82, though his stance suggested a man unwilling to surrender to time. The stiffness in his back was less fragility than discipline. Every breath was measured, as if each inhale and exhale were drawn from a lifetime of keeping composure when the world around him tried to unravel. The counter beneath the sergeant's hand was scratched and dulled from years of use, but it might as well have been a barrier meant to keep men like Harold out. His paperwork, wrinkled but carefully folded, lay trapped under that palm like a bird with broken wings. The sergeant's lips twisted slightly as he leaned closer, the faint smell of burnt coffee and stale cigarettes clinging to his uniform. It was not the scent of authority. It was the scent of someone hiding behind it. Harold did not speak. His silence was louder than any argument he could have made. The faint tremor in his left hand betrayed the strain of arthritis. Yet his right hand held firm to the leather bag at his side. The bag was not just a carrier of ear protection and ammunition. Its cracked seams and worn handle whispered of decades of careful use, journeys made to places where discipline was tested, where survival was not guaranteed. The shooters behind him grew restless. Boots scuffed against the tile floor, fabric shifted, rifles in their cases thudded softly as they were adjusted. The murmurs swelled and faded like uneasy waves, always crashing back against the rock of Harold's silence. His stillness was almost defiant, as if to say that he had stood against greater noise before, and this would not move him. A younger man near the front of the line cleared his throat, then muttered just loud enough for his companion. "Takes forever. He's holding us all up." His companion chuckled, a sound that rattled harsh against the fragile quiet. Harold's ear twitched at the noise, though his eyes remained fixed forward. Memories lingered at the edge of his vision, unbidden but vivid. The muffled laughter of soldiers in a cold bunker, men masking their fear with jokes as the sound of artillery rumbled overhead. The sergeant straightened his back, projecting the stiffness of duty, though his words cut with unnecessary sharpness. Rules are rules. If the clearance says expired, that means expired. I don't care what you think you renewed. His tone rang false. Not because the rules were wrong, but because the bite in his voice was sharper than they demanded. It was a performance meant to draw a line in the sand, one where he stood above the man before him. Harold adjusted his cap with a slow, deliberate motion. The fabric was faded, the stitching frayed, yet it bore its shape like a banner that refused to fall. The brim shadowed his eyes, but beneath it, there was steel. His lips parted as if he might finally speak, but instead he drew in a steadying breath and let the silence hold. It was a silence that once steadied trembling hands as he watched the world collapse in fire, a silence that once calmed his heartbeat in the moments before stepping into chaos. The room seemed to close in around him, each breath from those waiting turning heavier. Even the muffled thunder of rifles from the outdoor range seemed more distant now, as if the world beyond had chosen to watch and wait. The fluorescent lights above hummed, their steady buzz filling the pause where compassion might have lived. Instead of compassion, there was only tension, drawn taut across the space between the counter and the man who refused to move. One of the range employees farther down the desk shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between the sergeant and the old man. He looked as though he wanted to say something but thought better of it. His lips pressed into a tight line, and he busied himself with stacking forms that did not need stacking. Harold noticed the hesitation but gave no acknowledgement. It was a scene he had known before. Men who saw, men who knew, but chose silence in the presence of a louder voice. His grip on the bag tightened slightly, thumb brushing across a deep crack in the leather. The sensation of the rough seam pulled him backward in memory for an instant. He was no longer standing in a fluorescent-lit range, but crouched low in a damp trench, fingers curling around a rifle sling. The texture was the same, worn, fraying, dependable. For a heartbeat, the sharp tang of gun oil filled his nostrils, and the voices around him were replaced by the hushed prayers of young men not yet ready to die. Then the present returned, and the silence of the range pressed in once more. The sergeant shifted his weight, the leather of his belt creaking. His eyes darted toward the growing line, then snapped back to Harold. "I won't tell you again," he barked, his tone carrying a satisfaction that had nothing to do with efficiency. He wanted the spectacle. He wanted the control. His voice rose, pushing against the walls of the range like a drill instructor's command, but without the respect such commands once earned. Harold's chest rose and fell with another steady breath. His feet remained planted, boots slightly worn at the heel, their soles whispering of countless steps across parade grounds, across foreign soil, across hospital floors where recovery demanded as much courage as combat. These boots had carried him here, and they would not be moved by cruelty disguised as order. Behind the line of waiting men, someone let out a sharp sigh. Another shook his head. The crowd was restless, but it was not united. Some saw only inconvenience. Others saw a dignity being chipped at piece by piece. None spoke, not yet. The weight of silence grew heavier with every passing second. The younger pair near the back laughed again, the sound brittle. "He's probably just here to feel important," one muttered. The words struck the air like a careless bullet. Harold did not react outwardly, but deep in his chest, the memory of a different laughter returned. Nervous, trembling, carrying over the roar of waves crashing against a cold shore long ago. That laughter had belonged to boys who would never return home. The sting of it lanced sharper than the sergeant's words could. The hum of the lights grew louder in the silence that followed, or perhaps it was Harold's heartbeat that filled his ears. He rolled his shoulders back, straightening once more. His body ached, but his spine held. He would not bend for arrogance, just as he had not bent for the storms of war. His silence became a shield, and though it could not silence the jeers, it held fast against them. The sergeant's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked to the crowd, as though measuring the effect of his authority. He mistook their silence for approval. He mistook Harold's quiet for weakness, and so he pressed harder, the words biting again. "Last warning, old man. Move, now." The moment froze. Even the air seemed unwilling to move. Somewhere near the edge of the room, boots shifted against tile, slow and deliberate. A figure in combat uniform had turned, gaze fixed on the counter. His eyes, sharp and steady, did not waver. He had seen enough. The sergeant did not notice. The others held their breath. Harold remained unbroken, and the stillness promised change. Harold slowly lowered his bag onto the counter, the leather creaking under the strain of movement. His hands, though lined with age, moved with care and precision. He unzipped the bag, the faint rasp of metal teeth filling the silence. Inside were his ear protection, folded targets, and a neatly packed box of ammunition. Every item was arranged with the same order he had kept since the day he first handled a rifle. Each movement carried the weight of ritual, as though this preparation itself was a form of prayer. The sergeant watched with a smirk, his hand still pressed against the paperwork. "You're wasting your time. I already told you, this clearance isn't valid. If you can't follow procedure, you don't belong here." His voice was not loud enough to echo, but sharp enough to cut. The words were meant to sting, meant to be heard by the restless crowd behind Harold. Harold did not reply. He placed the ear protection gently on the counter, adjusting them until they sat square. Then he pulled free one of the folded targets. The edges were worn, faint creases cutting across the printed silhouette. His hands smoothed the paper flat, fingers pressing each fold as if ironing out the lines of memory themselves. The room felt smaller now, as though every eye watched not the paper, but the man who dared to remain still. From the back of the line, a scoff broke the quiet. "Look at him. Takes 5 minutes to open a bag." The whisper carried farther than the speaker intended, bouncing through the tense stillness like a pebble thrown into water. The sound drew a soft laugh from another, though it was quickly stifled when Harold did not flinch. His silence unsettled them. It was easier to mock if the target snapped back, harder when he did not. The sergeant seized on the moment, raising his chin. "You hear that? You're holding everyone up. Some of us have real training to do." His tone wrapped itself in authority, though his words betrayed impatience. He tapped his finger against the rejected ID card, as though each tap were a nail hammered into Harold's dignity. Harold's hand paused briefly on the target, the faint tremor in his fingers more pronounced now. Still, he pressed the paper into place and began folding it carefully once more. His discipline lay in the refusal to be rushed, in the patience that once kept him alive when haste would have meant death. Around him the range smelled of gun oil, hot brass, and dust, scents that stirred ghosts long buried. The fluorescent light above flickered once, humming louder as if joining the tension. Harold looked up for a brief second, his face illuminated in stark relief. Deep lines etched across his cheeks spoke of decades of endurance, but his eyes were calm. They were the eyes of someone who had seen chaos and carried on. For a moment, one of the younger men who had laughed earlier fell silent, unsettled by the calmness that seemed unbreakable. The sergeant cleared his throat, annoyed at the pause in his dominance. "Do you even know what lane you're supposed to be at? Or are you just planning to stand here all day?" His words carried no instruction, only insult. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, the posture of someone convinced the crowd shared his authority. Harold folded the target into thirds, aligning the edges with careful precision. His movements slowed even further, not from weakness, but from intention. His silence became heavier, pressing against the space like a weight. Each crease in the paper was deliberate, as though each fold bound another insult, sealing it away where it could no longer reach him. Behind him, one of the waiting shooters shifted impatiently, sighing loudly. Another shook his head, muttering under his breath. "Old-timer should just go home." The words carried no venom, only the casual cruelty of indifference. Yet they cut more deeply than shouted insults, because they were spoken as though Harold were invisible, as though he no longer mattered. Harold's ears caught every word. He did not turn, did not speak. Instead, he pressed the target flat against the counter once more. His thumb traced the silhouette, pausing on the printed outline of the head. For a fleeting moment, his vision blurred, and another face flickered in his mind. A young man's face, pale in the darkness of a foreign battlefield. He remembered adjusting his aim then, steadying his breath as chaos roared around him. The paper snapped back into clarity, and Harold blinked away the ghost. The sergeant's smirk widened. He had seen the pause and mistook it for weakness. That's what I thought. Not so steady anymore, are you? He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Harold and those nearest could hear. You should have stayed home. Nobody wants to see this. His words dripped with the venom of small power left unchecked. Harold's jaw tightened. His fingers, though aged and stiff, pressed firmly against the counter. His silence was no longer just refusal. It was defiance. Each breath he took was measured, like the rhythm of a march. He would not answer cruelty with words. He would outlast it, just as he had outlasted greater storms. The crowd grew restless again. A cough echoed from the back. Boots scraped the floor as a few men shifted their weight. One of the employees farther down the desk glanced nervously at the sergeant, then back to Harold. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He knew better than to intervene. His silence was the silence of fear, not respect. Harold recognized it instantly. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken judgment. Harold adjusted his cap once more, tugging it down until the brim shadowed his eyes again. His breath slowed, his spine straightened. Though surrounded by mutters and disdain, he held the line. His body remembered the weight of a rifle, the smell of cordite, the sting of rain on foreign soil. His presence, even unspoken, carried that history into the room. The sergeant tapped the ID card again, the sound sharp against the counter. Last chance. Either step aside or I'll have security escort you out. His words hung in the air like a threat, though the force behind them wavered slightly. For all his zeal, the sergeant did not yet understand why his authority felt fragile in this moment. Harold did not flinch. He lifted the folded target, aligning its edges neatly, and set it beside his ear protection. His hands trembled only faintly now, but his movements were unwavering. It was the quiet strength of someone who had endured more than insults could break. The room seemed to hold its breath with him, caught in the tension between silence and eruption. From the far end of the desk, the faint scrape of boots echoed against tile once more. The figure in combat uniform shifted again, his gaze sharper now, his presence undeniable. His paperwork lay forgotten on the counter in front of him. His eyes had not left Harold for several minutes. The weight of his watchful silence began to press against the scene, though no one else yet noticed. The sergeant, still drunk on the power of the moment, failed to see it. He squared his shoulders, preparing to strike again with words sharpened into weapons. Harold stood unmoved, his dignity unbroken. And though the insults grew louder, something else was stirring. The slow, deliberate attention of someone who would not remain silent for long. The sergeant lifted the rejected ID card again, holding it between two fingers as if it were contaminated. He turned it so the crowd behind Harold could see the bold red stamp of expiration across its surface. "Do you see this?" he barked. "Expired. Means you're not cleared to fire on these grounds. Means you don't belong here." His voice carried the sharp cadence of a command drill, yet his eyes gleamed with something personal, something hungry. He wanted the crowd to see him break the old man. Harold's lips parted slightly, his voice low but steady. That card was renewed last fall. It should be valid through this year. His tone carried no tremor, no apology, only the calm of someone stating fact. Yet his words were swallowed by the sergeant's raised voice before they could settle. "Enough!" the sergeant snapped, slamming the card back down on the counter so hard it jumped against the wood. "Don't argue with me. My orders are clear, and so are the rules. Step aside before you embarrass yourself further." His words dripped with authority, but his eagerness betrayed him. The bark was too sharp, the stance too stiff. He was not enforcing order, he was enjoying it. A man 2 places back in line stepped forward hesitantly. His hair was silver, his back slightly stooped, but his eyes flashed with something fierce. "Sergeant," he began, voice firm though quiet. "I know this man." He renewed his clearance. "Check your system again." His words were a lifeline cast into the storm, but it was swiftly cut. The sergeant's glare snapped to him, lips curling. "Not your business, sir. Fall back in line." His voice cracked across the room like a whip, sending the would-be ally back a step. The older man's shoulders stiffened, but his lips pressed shut. He glanced at Harold with regret, then lowered his eyes. The silence of failed support rang louder than the protest itself. Harold stood unmoved, though the muscles in his jaw tightened. His hand rested lightly on the folded target at the counter, his thumb brushing the paper's edge. He did not look at the man who had tried to help. He did not look at the sergeant. His gaze remained fixed on the middle distance, as though seeing something far beyond the sterile walls of the range. Behind him, the two younger men who had mocked earlier found their courage again. One leaned toward the other, grinning. "Guess he forgot to pay his membership fee," he whispered. The other snorted loudly, adding, "Maybe he forgot what day it is." Their laughter rolled across the silence, harsh and careless, a spotlight on the cruelty allowed to thrive unchecked. The sergeant's smirk deepened at their words, as if the mockery validated his authority. "You hear that?" he said, leaning closer to Harold. "You're holding up real shooters, people who actually belong here, not relics clinging to memories." The insult was sharper than the denial itself, meant not only to exclude but to erase. Harold's hand tightened slightly on the paper, crinkling its edge. His breath deepened once, then steadied. In his mind, the laughter behind him twisted into another sound, a group of young privates laughing in the dark, their voices trembling with fear they refused to admit. He remembered the weight of a rifle in his hands, the cold wind biting through his uniform, the sound of waves crashing on a hostile shore. He had been younger than those mocking voices, yet older in ways they could never imagine. The sergeant slammed his hand against the counter again, startling the employee down the line. "Security!" he barked, though no one moved. "Get this man out of my line. He's wasting everyone's time." The demand hung in the air, unanswered. The other staff exchanged nervous glances but did not act. Their silence was a form of complicity, though their eyes betrayed discomfort. The crowd grew restless, the weight of inaction pressing down on the room. Some shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. A few glanced toward the floor, unwilling to witness. Others looked directly at Harold, waiting to see if he would finally break. The atmosphere thickened, heavy with judgment and cowardice. Harold adjusted his cap once more, tugging it lower over his eyes. His silence had grown heavier, sharper. It was no longer just a shield. It was a statement. He would not give the sergeant the satisfaction of anger, nor the crowd the weakness of surrender. His quiet became its own defiance, more cutting than any words could have been. The sergeant's voice rose again, filled with impatience. "Last chance. Move, or I'll have you removed." He leaned forward until his nose nearly touched Harold's cap brim, his voice a hiss meant to belittle. "You don't belong here. Do you understand me?" The words were a dagger, designed not to enforce policy, but to strip dignity. Harold's eyes lifted for the first time, meeting the sergeant's glare. His gaze was steady, unwavering. His lips did not part, his voice did not rise, but his silence spoke volumes. It was the silence of a man who had once faced storms of steel and fire and returned alive. It was the silence of someone who had already proven where he belonged, long before this sergeant had ever been born. The younger men's laughter faltered at the sight of those eyes. Something ancient, something immovable, stared back at them from beneath the brim of that faded cap. The grin on one man's face slipped, his voice dying in his throat. The mockery no longer felt safe. The sergeant, however, missed the shift. His focus was consumed by his own need to dominate. He raised his voice higher so the entire line could hear. "Step aside, old man, or you'll be escorted out like a trespasser." His words rang through the room, sharp and final. He wanted the humiliation complete, witnessed by all. Harold's bag shifted slightly as his grip adjusted. His thumb brushed once more across the crack in the leather, grounding him. His chest rose and fell in measured rhythm. He would not move. He would not yield. The storm would pass, but his dignity would remain intact. At the edge of the room, the figure in combat uniform shifted again. Boots clicked softly against the tile, steady and deliberate. His hands unclenched from the folder of paperwork and his jaw tightened. His gaze had grown sharper, the kind of gaze that did not simply watch but judged. The silence before his step forward was thick, brimming with the promise of change. But still, the sergeant barked, blind to what loomed behind him. His voice cracked with arrogance, his authority unchecked. "Now!" he roared. "Step aside!" The words echoed like a false command, heavy but hollow. Harold stood rooted, silent as stone, his dignity unshaken. And in the charged stillness, the sense grew that the balance of the room was about to shift, and not in the sergeant's favor. The sergeant's voice tore through the room again, louder now, his words sharp enough to scrape the air. "Do you think you're special? That uniform you used to wear doesn't matter here. Expired clearance means no entry. Now move before I drag you out myself." The bark of his command rang hollow, but its cruelty struck deep, reverberating through the silent crowd. Harold's head lifted slightly at the mention of uniform. The word alone carried decades of memory, memories that pressed at the edges of his mind like ghosts knocking at the door. His eyes remained steady, though the lines around them deepened with quiet strain. He did not reply, but his silence was not submission. It was endurance, the same kind of stillness that had carried him through storms when noise and chaos had threatened to break lesser men. The sergeant leaned closer, his breath hot, reeking faintly of stale coffee and bitterness. His voice dropped to a growl, audible to those nearest. "You don't scare me with your stories. You're nothing but an old man with shaky hands and a head full of yesterday. This is my range now." His words were sharpened not by duty, but by arrogance, a misuse of authority that exposed his hunger for dominance. A faint murmur rose from the crowd, discomfort rippling through those waiting. One man shifted uneasily, glancing toward the door as if calculating whether to walk away rather than witness what was unfolding. Another clenched his jaw, but his hands stayed at his sides, unwilling to interfere. The silence of the crowd was heavy, each man weighed down by the choice between action and self-preservation. From the back, a younger shooter chuckled, emboldened by the sergeant's cruelty. "Maybe his hands shake so bad he can't even hit the target," he muttered. The laughter that followed was brittle, forced, but it pierced the quiet like a knife. Harold did not turn. His breath deepened once more, and he fixed his gaze on the counter in front of him, holding steady. The sergeant straightened, raising his voice again for the room. "That's right. This isn't a museum, and you're not an exhibit. Step aside before I make an example out of you." The words carried the cadence of a public shaming, meant to break dignity in front of witnesses. Each syllable was hammered with unnecessary force, as though volume could create legitimacy. Harold's hand drifted back to the handle of his leather bag. His thumb brushed the crack in its surface again, and in that touch, a memory surfaced. He remembered gripping the strap of his rifle while crouched in the cold mud, the world around him shaking with explosions. He remembered his hand trembling then, not from weakness, but from the cold. And still he had held firm. His silence now was that same strength, reborn in a different battlefield. A man near the middle of the line cleared his throat, starting to speak. "Sergeant, maybe," but the glare he received silenced him before the sentence could finish. The sergeant's eyes burned with warning, and the man lowered his gaze quickly, ashamed. The attempt at support dissolved into nothing, swallowed by the fear that permeated the room. Harold's cap brim shaded his eyes, but the faintest flicker of pain crossed his features. Not from the insult, but from the realization that silence had once again claimed those who might have stood beside him. It was a familiar pattern, repeated across decades. A few speak, most remain silent, and the weight of endurance falls on the shoulders of one. Still, his spine straightened. He would not bend. The sergeant's voice rose again, his zeal sharpened by the crowd's inaction. "This is your final warning. Step aside, old man." He raised his arm slightly, gesturing as though summoning force to remove Harold physically. The motion was unnecessary, theatrical, designed only to remind everyone present of his supposed power. His arrogance filled the space, swelling against the walls until the silence felt strangled. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their steady buzz a backdrop to the rising tension. Harold's heartbeat echoed faintly in his ears, steady, deliberate. His breath did not falter. He remained planted, his boots firm against the tile. His presence was quiet but immovable, the dignity of a man who had once stood on harsher ground. At the far edge of the counter, Captain Daniel Reyes shifted. His boots pressed firmly against the floor, the leather creaking with the motion. He set his paperwork aside, forgotten. His jaw tightened, and his eyes locked on the scene unfolding. The silence of his presence was different than the crowd's silence. His was the silence of measured decision, of a soldier calculating the moment when observation must become intervention. The sergeant, blind to the weight of that gaze, pressed harder. He leaned close again, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think standing still makes you strong? You're nothing here. You're just wasting everyone's time." The words echoed cruelly, ringing in the ears of those who knew better, though none dared to answer. Harold shifted slightly, lifting his chin. The movement was subtle, but it carried the weight of defiance. His silence sharpened, becoming a blade that cut deeper than any shouted retort. His gaze, still hidden beneath the shadow of his cap, flicked briefly toward the crowd, not seeking pity, but daring them to witness what dignity looked like under fire. The younger men who had mocked earlier grew restless. One swallowed hard, the laughter fading from his lips as unease crept in. The steadiness of Harold's silence unsettled him, as though he were staring at a stone wall that no insult could crack. His companion shifted his weight nervously, glancing at the sergeant, as if to confirm whether the mockery was still safe. Reyes's eyes narrowed further, the muscle in his jaw twitching. His chest rose slowly, then fell, his breath measured. He had not planned to step into this moment when he arrived at the range, but the weight of injustice pressed harder now, unbearable. Each insult from the sergeant rang louder than the last, and Reyes knew the time for silence was closing fast. The sergeant slammed his hand on the counter one final time, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Out! Now!" he roared, his voice filling the room with hollow thunder. The command was meant to finish it, to break the old man in front of every witness. His eyes gleamed with the expectation of victory, of compliance. But Harold did not move. His chest rose, his shoulders squared, and his silence held. He remained rooted, as steady as the mountains. The sergeant's bark rolled past him like wind over stone, heard but powerless. His dignity endured, unbroken. At that moment, the silence in the room shifted. It was no longer just fear or discomfort. It was the silence that comes before change. At the far side of the counter, Captain Reyes stepped forward, his boots striking the tile with quiet authority. His presence filled the room before his voice ever did. The balance had shifted. The storm was about to break. Harold did not move, even after the sergeant's last barked order echoed through the range lobby. The command had rolled off him like rain against stone. His chest rose slowly, his breath steady, the rhythm of a man who had once learned to control his pulse under the pressure of life and death. His silence was not emptiness. It was strength compressed into stillness, a strength that no voice, no insult, could shatter. The sergeant's hand hovered above the counter, fingers twitching as though preparing to strike down with another slam. His expression hardened, but a shadow of uncertainty flickered in his eyes. For all his bluster, he had expected compliance by now. He had expected surrender. Instead, he found himself staring at a man who did not bend, whose refusal was not shouted but carved into the very lines of his face. Harold adjusted the brim of his cap again, a small and measured motion. The fabric was frayed along the edge, threads sticking loose like scars left untended. He straightened the cap, tugging it down just enough to shadow his eyes once more. Beneath the brim, those eyes glimmered with memories that no one in the room could see. The flicker of firelight in the dark, the shimmer of frost along frozen ground, the shapes of men huddled close against the wind. His silence carried all of it, though the sergeant heard none of it. The crowd shifted uneasily, the silence pressing harder against them. One man near the back crossed his arms tightly, his gaze flicking between the sergeant and Harold. Another shuffled his boots, his discomfort obvious, but his lips sealed. Each man waited for someone else to step forward, each man weighed down by the choice to stay silent. Their inaction created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, Harold's dignity filled the room. From the far end, Captain Reyes remained still, but his stillness was not passive. His eyes tracked every motion, every word, every flicker of tension between the old man and the sergeant. His hands rested on the counter, his posture rigid but controlled. The fabric of his combat uniform caught the fluorescent light, the patches and insignia quietly declaring his authority without the need for speech. His silence was purposeful, not cowardly. He was a soldier measuring the right moment to intervene. The sergeant mistook that silence for support. His chest swelled, and he barked again, though his words lacked the same sharpness as before. "I said move! Are you deaf, old man? This isn't a game!" His voice cracked slightly, a note of strain in his command. His authority, once inflated, now wavered against the unyielding quiet of his target. Harold's hand rested lightly on the folded target at the counter, his thumb brushing its edge. The paper was thin, fragile, yet in his grip it became something steady, something unbroken. He pressed it flat, aligning the corners with careful precision, as if to remind himself that order could still be carved from chaos. Around him, the murmurs of the crowd dimmed again, caught between discomfort and fascination. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, their hum steady and cold. Harold's eyes flicked upward for the briefest moment, and the glare reminded him of another ceiling, a low roof of corrugated steel, smoke curling above as shells shook the earth outside. He remembered the sound of his own breath then, slow and controlled, matching the rhythm of men waiting in silence for the storm to pass. That memory clung to him now, tethering him in the face of humiliation. The sergeant leaned forward once more, close enough that his voice could not be ignored. "You're making a fool of yourself. Everyone here sees it. Step aside before you embarrass yourself beyond repair." His words were meant to wound, but his tone carried a trace of impatience, as though even he knew the humiliation was losing its edge. Harold's lips parted slightly, and for a moment it seemed he might finally speak. Instead, he drew in a steadying breath and released it in silence. His voice, long trained to command and endure, remained locked away. The silence was louder than any retort could have been. It drew the sting from the insult, left the sergeant's words floundering in empty air. The younger men who had mocked earlier shifted again. One glanced around nervously, his grin faltering. The other scratched at his neck, his laughter gone. They had expected a broken old man, someone to collapse under ridicule. What they faced instead unsettled them. They were watching a wall of endurance, a silence that refused to crumble. Their mockery now felt childish in the face of it. Captain Reyes's gaze hardened. His jaw flexed once, the faintest sign of his patience thinning. He had not intended to involve himself in another man's struggle that day, yet every passing moment tested the line between restraint and duty. He could feel the dishonor of the scene pressing against him, demanding an answer. His hands tightened slightly on the counter, knuckles whitening as the weight of decision grew heavier. The sergeant noticed none of it. His arrogance shielded him from awareness. He raised his voice again, desperate to reclaim control. "If you think standing there makes you strong, you're wrong. It makes you pathetic. Step aside before I have you carried out." His voice cracked louder, echoing against the walls, but the desperation beneath it rang clear to those who listened closely. Harold did not move. His shoulders squared, his posture firm. He looked not like a man defeated, but like a man braced against a storm. The silence around him was no longer empty. It was filled with dignity, with the unspoken weight of sacrifice, with the calm of someone who had faced worse and endured. The room itself seemed to shift under that weight. The murmurs stilled, the mocking voices silenced. The crowd felt the gravity of Harold's presence, though few could name it. It was the gravity of history pressing against the present, demanding respect where none had been offered. The air grew thick, heavy with recognition unspoken. Reyes's boots shifted again, slow and deliberate. The sound was soft, but it cut through the silence like a warning bell. His stance changed slightly, his body angling toward the counter. His authority filled the space without a word spoken, the quiet promise of action heavy in the air. The sergeant's eyes darted briefly toward the shifting sound, but his arrogance pulled him back to the man in front of him. He still believed the silence of the room meant he had won. He still believed that authority unchecked was unbreakable. He did not yet see the storm gathering at his shoulder. Harold's thumb pressed harder against the crack in his leather bag handle. The rough seam grounded him, tethered him to the present. His breath steadied again, each inhale slow, each exhale controlled. He was not broken. He was not moved. He held the line, silent and unyielding. The silence that followed grew unbearable, pressing against every corner of the room. It was the silence before thunder, the pause before eruption. At the edge of the counter, Captain Reyes's gaze sharpened, his decision made. The moment to remain still had passed. The time to step forward had come. Captain Reyes stepped away from the counter at the far end of the room, his boots striking the tile with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound was not loud, but it cut through the suffocating silence like a drumbeat, measured and commanding. Each step carried authority earned, not granted. Heads turned instinctively, eyes following the movement of a man who carried the weight of uniform with quiet certainty. His combat uniform was pressed and immaculate despite the dust of the day. The insignia on his chest caught the glow of the overhead lights, subtle but unmistakable. The patches stitched into the fabric did not need explanation. They announced his station more clearly than words ever could. The room shifted under his presence, the air thickening with recognition of authority that did not need to be demanded. Reyes stopped a few paces behind Harold, his posture straight, his arms at his sides. He did not speak. He simply watched. The silence of his observation was heavier than the sergeant's shouting had ever been. Where the sergeant's voice sought power, Reyes's stillness embodied it. The difference was undeniable, though the sergeant had yet to realize it. Harold felt the shift without turning. He did not need to see the man behind him to recognize the kind of presence that had entered the space. It was the weight of a soldier, the gravity of someone who had walked the same ground, breathed the same dust, carried the same burdens. Harold's shoulders relaxed slightly, not in surrender, but in the subtle acknowledgement that he was no longer entirely alone. The sergeant frowned, glancing briefly toward the movement. His eyes caught the figure in combat uniform, but slid away too quickly, dismissing what he should have recognized instantly. His arrogance clouded his perception, convincing him that his authority remained unchallenged. He snapped his gaze back to Harold, mistaking his continued silence for weakness. "You think standing there proves something?" The sergeant barked again, his voice louder than before. The words rang through the lobby, but for the first time they felt hollow. The volume could not mask the strain edging into his tone. His confidence wavered in the presence of an authority he could not yet define. Reyes's hands clenched briefly, then released. He had not yet spoken, but his eyes said enough. They were sharp, unyielding, fixed on the exchange with a focus that carved through the air. Those closest to him shifted nervously, sensing the gravity building around the silent officer. The mocking whispers in the back faltered, uneasy under a weight they could not name. Harold adjusted his folded target on the counter once more, pressing it flat with steady hands. His thumb brushed the paper's edge, his ritual unbroken. He had not spoken a word since the ordeal began, and yet he was no longer the only silence in the room. Now his quiet endurance was joined by the silent authority of another, the two forces colliding into a presence that made the air feel heavier. The sergeant's lip curled as he leaned closer again. "This is your last chance. Step aside, or I'll have you removed." The words were sharp, but their edge had dulled. His voice carried a note of unease, though his arrogance pressed him to continue the performance. He had not yet understood that the stage was no longer his. Reyes took another step forward, closing the distance. The sound of his boots striking the tile was soft but commanding, a heartbeat in the silence. He now stood directly behind Harold, tall and steady, his uniform crisp, his presence undeniable. Still, he did not speak. His silence was deliberate, sharpening the contrast between the sergeant's hollow volume and his own restrained control. The crowd noticed. Men shifted their stances, their eyes flicking nervously between the sergeant and the officer now looming behind the old veteran. A ripple of recognition passed through them, though no one dared to voice it aloud. The silence grew heavier, oppressive, the anticipation of words that had not yet been spoken. Harold felt the weight behind him. His breath steadied further, as though reinforced by the presence at his back. He adjusted his cap again, the motion small but meaningful. For the first time since the confrontation began, the line of tension etched across his shoulders softened slightly. It was not relief, but solidarity. The sergeant finally turned his head fully, his eyes catching the insignia on Reyes's chest. His mouth opened slightly, though no words came. A flicker of recognition sparked in his gaze, quickly smothered by arrogance. He forced a scoff, trying to mask the unease crawling beneath his skin. He straightened, puffing his chest in a false display of confidence. Reyes's expression did not change. His eyes locked on the sergeant, sharp and unwavering. He remained silent, letting the weight of his gaze do what words could not. The room itself seemed to tighten, every man present sensing the balance shifting. The authority the sergeant had claimed was crumbling, stripped away by the presence of someone who embodied it without effort. The sergeant cleared his throat, his voice rising again, though it cracked slightly. "What? You think standing there makes you part of this? This is my line, my rules." His words tumbled out too quickly, betraying the panic edging into his bravado. His performance faltered in the face of silence that exposed his bluster. Harold remained steady, his silence reinforced by the man behind him. He felt the change without needing to look. For the first time in this ordeal, he was no longer a solitary figure against the tide. His dignity, unbroken from the beginning, now stood reflected in the quiet strength of another uniform. The younger men in the back whispered nervously, their mockery dissolving. The sight of a combat-uniformed officer standing behind the old man unsettled them. The laughter that once felt easy now tasted bitter. They shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado crumbling as the atmosphere grew heavier. Reyes finally adjusted his stance, planting his boots firmly, shoulders squared. His silence was nearly unbearable now, a pressure that weighed on the room like the seconds before thunder. He had waited long enough. His gaze sharpened once more, and the decision was made. The moment for stillness had passed. The sergeant's eyes widened slightly, as though he had just realized the ground beneath him was shifting. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words faltered on his tongue. The authority he had wielded so carelessly was slipping through his fingers, and the presence behind Harold made that truth undeniable. The silence reached its peak, pressing against the walls, holding every man's breath captive. Then, with a calmness sharper than any shout, Captain Reyes prepared to break it. The silence pressed down like a storm cloud ready to break. Every man in the lobby felt the weight of it, though none knew how long it could last. Harold remained unmoved, rooted to the floor, as though his boots were nailed into the tile. Behind him, Captain Reyes stood tall, his combat uniform a quiet declaration of authority. The air between them carried something unspoken, a bond born not of words, but of recognition. The sergeant squared his shoulders, his bravado flickering but not yet gone. He clenched his jaw, forcing a sneer across his lips. I said out, "Are you deaf? I'll call security this instant." His hand twitched as though reaching for a radio, but no one believed he would use it. The cracks in his voice betrayed him, his false confidence slipping like sand through open fingers. Reyes took one final step forward. The sound of his boots against the tile was soft but commanding, cutting through the heavy silence. Now he stood directly beside Harold, tall and still, his shadow falling across the counter. His presence alone seemed to dim the arrogance of the room. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes locked on the sergeant with a calm that was more dangerous than anger. Without a word, Reyes bent down and retrieved Harold's ear protection, which had slipped slightly off the counter during the commotion. He brushed the dust from it with one gloved hand and placed it gently back on the wood. The small act carried more weight than any shouted command. It was a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, and the room felt the shift immediately. The sergeant's sneer faltered. His eyes flicked from the old man to the officer now standing beside him. But still he forced his voice higher, unwilling to surrender. "Sir, this isn't your concern. This man's clearance is expired. He doesn't belong here." His tone strained, sharp but brittle. The words rang false, even to his own ears. Reyes finally spoke, his voice quiet but resonant, carrying easily through the silence. "This man stands. Here. Today." He did not raise his voice, yet the words echoed louder than the sergeant's barked commands. They rang with authority, not because of volume, but because they carried truth. The weight of those words struck every man in the room. The crowd stilled. The murmurs that had filled the air earlier vanished into silence. Even the mocking shooters in the back lowered their eyes, suddenly aware of the gravity they had ignored. The atmosphere shifted entirely. The balance of power torn from the sergeant's grasp and placed squarely in the presence of the man who had spoken only once. Harold's hand tightened on the handle of his bag, the leather crack biting into his palm. His shoulders lifted slightly, his spine straightening further. For the first time, he allowed his head to turn just enough to see the officer beside him. Their eyes met in brief acknowledgement, no words exchanged, but something unspoken passed between them. A recognition, a bond. The sergeant flushed, anger and unease mixing across his face. "You don't have the authority to override my orders," he snapped, though his voice wavered. He jabbed a finger toward the paperwork, as if the flimsy piece of paper could shield him from the authority standing before him. His performance grew more desperate with every word. Reyes did not move, his gaze steady, unflinching. "Authority is not in the paper," he said softly. "It is in respect, and respect has been denied here." His words struck with the precision of a hammer, not loud, but impossible to ignore. The silence that followed was sharper than any rebuke. The sergeant's hand trembled slightly at his side, though he tried to disguise it by adjusting his belt. His eyes darted toward the staff, searching for support, but found only lowered gazes and shifting feet. His confidence cracked further, crumbling under the weight of a man who had spoken only twice. Harold turned back to the counter, his hands once more arranging the target he had folded so carefully. The paper trembled faintly as he pressed it flat, but his touch remained deliberate, controlled. His silence was no longer solitary. It was reinforced by the quiet strength of another. Together, their stillness became unshakable. The younger men in the back looked away, their laughter dead. One shifted awkwardly, scratching at his arm, avoiding the gaze of the officer who now commanded the room without effort. Their mockery dissolved into shame, the echo of their earlier words hanging like smoke they could not clear. Reyes adjusted his stance, planting his boots firmly, his posture tall and resolute. His presence seemed to expand, filling every corner of the lobby. He had not raised his voice once, but the room felt commanded, not by orders, but by the unspoken demand for dignity. The sergeant's voice broke again, weak beneath the pressure. "This isn't regulation. He doesn't belong." The words faltered mid-sentence, collapsing under the weight of truth. The paper he had clung to so tightly as justification now looked flimsy even to him. His authority drained from his tone, leaving only the naked sound of desperation. Reyes placed one hand flat on the counter, fingers spread, his voice calm but cutting. "He belongs here more than anyone in this room." The sentence landed with finality, leaving no room for argument. The silence that followed was not tense, but reverent, the weight of those words sealing the truth into the air. Harold's eyes softened, the faintest flicker of relief crossing his face. Not gratitude, not surrender, but acknowledgement. His silence had held, his dignity remained intact, and now it had been affirmed aloud. The years that had worn on him had not erased his worth. That truth filled the room like oxygen, returning after suffocation. The sergeant opened his mouth again, but no sound came. His voice had been stripped away, rendered powerless. He looked at the officer standing before him and saw authority he could not mimic, respect he could not demand. For the first time, he faltered, his bluster crumbling into silence. The room was utterly still. Every man present felt the shift, the tide turning irrevocably. Harold was no longer a man being humiliated at a counter. He was a veteran standing tall, his dignity defended not with words of anger but with quiet strength. And beside him stood a Marine captain who had made it clear, respect would not be denied here. The sergeant's voice died in his throat, leaving only the hum of the overhead lights and the muted sound of rifle fire beyond the doors. The room felt suspended, caught in a silence too heavy to break with careless words. Every man standing in line held his breath, waiting for the weight of the moment to settle. Harold's hands rested lightly on the folded target before him. His fingers, stiff and lined with veins, pressed against the paper with the same deliberate care he had used to steady a rifle long ago. He lifted his head slightly, turning just enough to meet the eyes of the man who now stood beside him. Captain Reyes's gaze was steady, his expression unreadable, yet filled with something that passed deeper than sympathy. It was recognition, the kind that traveled through decades of service, through bloodlines of sacrifice, through the unspoken knowledge of what it meant to carry a burden no one else could see. Their eyes locked, and for an instant, the noise of the world vanished. Neither spoke. They did not need to. In that brief exchange, Harold saw not just a younger man in uniform, but a reflection of his own past. The discipline, the weight, the scars that came with wearing it. And Reyes, staring into those weathered eyes, saw the living embodiment of stories he had only heard, of sacrifices that had shaped the very traditions he now served. The silence between them was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with memory, with respect, with the bond of soldiers who understood that words could never capture what service truly meant. The air grew thick with it, pressing against every corner of the lobby. The crowd felt it too, though they could not name it. One of the younger men who had mocked earlier shifted uncomfortably, his smirk gone. His eyes dropped to the floor, unable to bear the weight of the silence. His companion rubbed at the back of his neck, suddenly restless, the sting of shame prickling at his skin. Their earlier laughter now hung in the air like smoke, acrid and unwelcome. A man farther back in line straightened unconsciously, his arms falling to his sides as though standing at attention. Another removed his cap, lowering his gaze slightly in respect. No command had been given, but the authority of the moment demanded it. The crowd's posture began to change, as though the dignity radiating from the two men at the counter seeped into their bones. The sergeant swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had not spoken since Reyes's last words, and now he found himself caught in the gravity of the silence he had tried to break. His arrogance faltered further, his chest no longer puffed with false confidence. He glanced around the room, seeking the support of the crowd, but found only lowered eyes and tightened jaws. His power was gone, drained into the silence. Harold adjusted his cap again, the brim shadowing his eyes. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of ritual. It was the motion of a man acknowledging his place, not in weakness, but in pride. He had stood alone for so long, enduring insult in silence. Now his silence was joined, reflected, strengthened. Reyes shifted his stance slightly, planting his boots more firmly against the tile. His shoulders squared, his head lifted, but still he did not speak. His silence mirrored Harold's, their quiet endurance forming a wall that no insult could pierce. The bond between them needed no explanation. Every man watching could feel it. The air in the lobby grew heavier still, pressing against lungs and hearts alike. The younger shooters who had scoffed earlier now avoided Harold's gaze, their bravado stripped bare. The weight of their mockery lingered around them like a stain, and though no one called them out, the shame was louder than accusation. Harold's hand moved once more to the cracked handle of his leather bag. His thumb brushed the seam, grounding him in the present. The roughness beneath his skin tethered him, reminding him that he was still here, still standing, still unbroken. The silence around him no longer felt like isolation. It felt like recognition. Reyes inhaled deeply, the rise of his chest slow, deliberate. His eyes softened just slightly, though his jaw remained set. He had stepped forward out of duty, but in this moment, it was more than duty. It was reverence. The man beside him was no stranger, no inconvenience. He was a link in the chain that bound past to present. The sergeant's hand twitched again at his side. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came. The silence weighed too heavily, his arrogance stripped away. He found himself a spectator in a moment that no longer belonged to him. His presence was shrinking, his authority evaporating before his eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but their hum now seemed distant, secondary to the gravity of the room. The only sounds were the faint creaks of shifting boots and the measured breaths of the two men at the counter. Time slowed, stretching into a pause that felt eternal. The men in line exchanged glances, some with guilt, others with awe. None spoke. They had witnessed humiliation turned into dignity, cruelty transformed into reverence, all without a single raised fist or shouted word. The silence itself had become the lesson. Harold's eyes lingered on Reyes for a moment longer before he turned back to the counter. His shoulders lifted with one final breath, then settled into stillness. The bond had been acknowledged. That was enough. He no longer stood alone. Reyes remained beside him, his presence a shield as much as a declaration. He did not place a hand on Harold's shoulder, did not need to. His silence was touch enough, steady and unwavering. Together they filled the room with something stronger than command, brotherhood. The crowd exhaled as one, a sound that rippled through the lobby like a released breath held too long. The silence was not broken, but eased, softened. The moment of recognition had passed between the two men, and everyone else had felt its weight. And then, just as the stillness seemed to settle, Reyes finally drew in a sharp breath. His voice, when it came, was quiet but deliberate. He asked a question no civilian could have asked, a question that would pull history into the present and reveal the truth of who Harold Benton really was. Reyes inhaled, his chest rising slowly, the silence around him thick as stone. His eyes did not leave Harold's face, the weathered lines, the stubborn set of his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but sharp, carrying the weight of recognition. "Sir, what company were you with at Incheon?" The question sliced through the stillness like a blade. It was not the kind of question a civilian could ever form. It was a question rooted in history, in memory, in the language of those who had lived the cold and fire of war. The crowd shifted uneasily, though few understood the depth of what had been asked. Only Harold knew. Only Harold could answer. Harold's eyes narrowed, the brim of his cap casting a shadow across his face. His lips parted slowly. The words caught in his throat before finding air. "Fox Company," he said at last, his voice low but steady. The syllables carried the weight of decades, the echo of voices long gone. 7th Marines. The room froze. The murmurs that had been building in the crowd collapsed into silence once more. Even those who did not understand the full significance of the answer felt its gravity. The words did not sound like a boast. They sounded like a testimony, a truth carved in blood and sacrifice. Reyes's jaw tightened, his eyes softening with reverence. His voice lowered, almost a whisper, yet it reached every ear in the room. "My grandfather told me about the men who stood at Incheon. He said they were made of iron." His words were not praise but confession, a reverence passed down from one generation to another. Harold's gaze flickered, and for a moment his silence cracked. A memory surged forward unbidden, the stench of salt water and smoke. The deafening roar of artillery shaking the earth, the cries of men pushing forward through chaos. He remembered the freezing bite of the sea around his legs, the weight of the rifle in his arms, the mud that clung to his boots as he staggered across foreign ground. The memory burned in his chest, alive and merciless. His fingers trembled against the handle of his bag. For years, he had carried those memories in silence, a burden too heavy to share. Now, with one question, they had been dragged into the open. He steadied his breath, forcing his voice to hold. "Red clay," he murmured, his words trembling but sharp. It smelled like rust, steam rising off the dead. The crowd shifted, stunned by the imagery, by the weight of words that carried truth no man would invent. The younger shooters who had mocked earlier lowered their heads, their faces burning with shame. Their laughter had no place in the face of such memories. The sergeant swallowed hard, his arrogance collapsing with each passing second. He looked at Harold as though seeing him for the first time, the title of old man stripped away and replaced with something far heavier. His lips parted, but no words came. His voice had abandoned him. Reyes nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Harold's. "My grandfather told me that those men never broke, that they held the line when no one thought it could be held." His voice trembled faintly, not with weakness, but with reverence. "He told me to honor them with everything I do." Harold's breath caught in his chest. For years, he had walked into places unnoticed, dismissed as a relic, forgotten by the world he had fought for. Now, standing in a fluorescent-lit range lobby, a stranger in combat uniform had pulled his history into the light. The weight of it settled across his shoulders, but this time, it was not a burden. It was recognition. The silence of the room was no longer heavy with tension. It was heavy with reverence. Every man present felt the shift. No one moved. No one spoke. They had become witnesses to a truth larger than themselves, a history written in sacrifice and carried into the present by the man who stood silently at the counter. The sergeant lowered his gaze, his earlier bravado shattered. The flush of power that had burned in his face was gone, replaced by something pale, unsettled. He had shouted at a man who had once walked through fire and cold, who had stood on a battlefield that history itself whispered about. His arrogance dissolved into silence, leaving him exposed. Reyes placed his hand flat on the counter again, his fingers steady, his voice deliberate. "This man has already earned every right to stand here. He does not need your approval. He does not need clearance on a piece of paper." His words struck like iron, final and undeniable. The truth filled the room, stripping away any argument. Harold closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply. For the first time since the confrontation began, the breath did not feel like a shield. It felt like release. He opened his eyes again, his gaze meeting Reyes's with the faintest nod. It was gratitude unspoken, acknowledgement given not with words, but with the silence of soldiers who understood. The younger men shifted again, their shame unrelenting. One clenched his fists tightly, as though angry at himself for what he had said. Another bit his lip, eyes locked on the floor, unable to face the weight of his own mockery. Their silence was no longer arrogance, it was penitence. The sergeant exhaled shakily, his body deflating. His hands, once clenched with power, now hung limply at his sides. He opened his mouth once more, but still no sound came. His authority had been stripped bare, his arrogance shattered by truth. The room no longer belonged to him. Reyes's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice calm but cutting. "You cannot strip honor from a man who stood at Incheon. You can only reveal your own dishonor by trying." The words struck the sergeant like a hammer, leaving him pale and silent. The room shifted once more, reverence replacing arrogance in every corner. Harold's silence held, but it no longer carried the weight of isolation. It was shared now, reflected in the posture of the man beside him, mirrored in the bowed heads of those who listened. The silence itself had become a monument, a testament to survival, to sacrifice, to dignity that no insult could erase. The truth had landed like a hammer, unshakable and undeniable. The men who had mocked him could not look away. The sergeant who had humiliated him could not speak, and the veteran who had stood in silence was finally seen for who he truly was. The silence that followed Harold's words clung to the room like fog. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly. The raw truth of his past hung heavy in the air, undeniable and absolute. It was not a story told secondhand, not a memory recounted for applause. It was a fragment of history spoken in the simplest of words, and it had struck harder than any shout. Captain Reyes's eyes lingered on Harold's face, reading the lines carved by years of endurance. He gave the smallest nod, a gesture of respect from one soldier to another. Then he turned his gaze toward the sergeant, his expression sharpening, his authority no longer silent, but ready to be voiced. "Sergeant," Reyes said, his tone calm but edged with steel, "you will step back." The words were not shouted, but their weight filled every corner of the room. The command carried the authority of rank, but more than that, it carried the authority of truth. The sergeant stiffened, his eyes flicking nervously between Reyes's insignia and the steady stares of the men in line. His lips parted, but the protest that had once come so easily stuck in his throat. He saw no support in the faces around him, no approval for the cruelty he had wielded so confidently moments before. He swallowed hard, his arrogance dissolving into shame. Reyes took a step closer to the counter, his boots striking the tile with quiet finality. "You've forgotten what leadership looks like," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "It is not in humiliation. It is not in twisting rules for the sake of pride. It is in respect, especially for those who carried the weight long before us." The sergeant's shoulders slumped, his chest deflating. His hands, which had been clenched tightly, now hung at his sides, useless and heavy. He nodded faintly, the flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. The authority he had once demanded had been stripped from him, leaving only the hollow shell of his earlier bravado. The men in line shifted as one. Where before there had been unease and silence, now there was acknowledgement. One man straightened his posture, standing taller as if the words had lifted him. Another bowed his head slightly, his hand brushing against the brim of his cap. A ripple of recognition spread through them, unspoken but undeniable. Harold adjusted his cap once more, tugging the brim into place with steady hands. He did not smile, did not gloat, did not revel in the shift. His silence remained, but now it carried a different weight. No longer defensive, it was affirming. The silence of a man who had finally been seen. Reyes turned back toward Harold, extending a hand not to command but to steady. His fingers brushed lightly against the old veteran's arm, guiding him forward toward the range with the respect of a brother, not the pity of a stranger. It was not a gesture of saving. It was a gesture of standing beside. The sergeant stepped back from the counter, his eyes lowered. He could no longer meet Harold's gaze, nor Reyes's. His punishment was not in shouted rebuke or formal reprimand. It was in the silence of the room, in the way his authority had been dismantled by a single truth he had tried so hard to bury. The younger men who had mocked earlier shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale. One pressed his lips together, as if holding back words of apology. He did not yet have the courage to speak. The other glanced at Harold, his eyes filled with something closer to awe than ridicule. Their shame was its own correction, their silence now laced with regret. Reyes's voice broke the quiet once more, steady and calm. "From this day forward, if a Marine who stood at Incheon comes to this range, you give him the first lane." The words were not shouted, not asked. They were declared, etched into the air as though carved in stone. The staff behind the counter straightened, their eyes wide, their silence now filled with agreement. None protested, none dared. The weight of Reyes's words settled into them like a commandment, one that would not be forgotten. Harold lifted his folded target from the counter and placed it under his arm. His hands still trembled faintly with age, but his movements were deliberate. He walked forward, his boots tapping against the tile with the rhythm of a march. The crowd parted quietly, stepping aside with the instinctive deference of men in the presence of something larger than themselves. Reyes walked beside him, his stride measured, his shoulders squared. He did not lead Harold, nor did he follow. He walked as a brother, his presence a shield against the shame that had been thrown at the old man moments before. Together they moved toward the firing lanes, their steps steady, their silence heavier than words. The sergeant remained at the counter, his head bowed. The sound of boots passing him was louder than any rebuke. He felt the sting of humiliation not from punishment, but from truth laid bare. His arrogance had collapsed into the weight of discipline he had failed to honor. The air in the lobby shifted completely as Harold reached the lane. The tension that had once strangled the room loosened, replaced by something quieter, deeper, respect. No one cheered, no one applauded. The silence itself was the recognition, solemn and profound. Harold set his bag gently on the bench, his fingers moving with the same ritual care he had shown before. He laid out his ear protection, his target, his ammunition, each motion steady and precise. But this time, the silence surrounding him was not filled with mockery or doubt. It was filled with reverence. The moment felt permanent, etched into the very walls of the range. It was not a scene that would be forgotten. It was not a gesture that would fade. From that day forward, Harold Benton was no longer just another man at the counter. He was a living link to history, and the respect owed to him had finally been restored. The week passed quietly, but the memory of what had unfolded in the range lobby lingered like smoke after a fire. Men spoke of it in hushed voices, not as gossip, but as testimony. The sight of the old veteran standing unbroken, and the Marine captain stepping forward to stand beside him, had carved itself into the walls of the place. It could not be erased. On a Tuesday morning, the range opened its doors as usual. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the lobby, mingling with the faint smell of oil and cordite. But the air felt different now. Every man who entered seemed to carry himself with a bit more weight, a bit more awareness of the place they stood in. Respect had rooted itself into the very tile beneath their boots. Harold arrived with the same slow, deliberate steps he always took. His leather bag swung lightly at his side, the cracked handle pressed into the palm of his hand. His cap was pulled low, the brim shading eyes that remained sharp despite the years. He walked with no announcement, no expectation, yet heads turned all the same. The younger shooters who had once mocked him fell silent as he passed. Their eyes dropped, their mouths pressed shut. One man shifted his rifle case to his other hand, nodding faintly as Harold moved by. It was not apology spoken aloud, but the gesture carried its own weight. Respect was no longer forced, it was instinctive. Behind the counter stood the sergeant, his posture straighter than before. The arrogance that had once laced his stance was gone, replaced with something more careful. His uniform was tidy, his eyes alert, his voice softer as he greeted those in line. When Harold approached, the sergeant did not bark or posture. He stepped aside, clearing the way with a motion that carried no fanfare, only humility. "Lane 1 is ready for you, sir," he said quietly. His voice held none of the sharpness from before. Instead, it carried the weight of a lesson learned too late but not ignored. His words were not a performance. They were an acknowledgement. Harold gave the faintest nod, his silence carrying more weight than words could have. He did not gloat, did not dwell on the humiliation that had once filled this same space. His dignity needed no announcement. His presence was enough. The sergeant did not move away. Instead, he reached down and lifted a fresh paper target, sliding it across the counter. His hands trembled faintly, though not from fear. He looked Harold in the eye for a brief moment, then lowered his gaze, his posture stiff. The gesture was simple, but it carried the gravity of penance. Harold accepted the target with steady hands, pressing it flat, as he always did. The ritual was unchanged, but the silence surrounding it was different now. It was no longer filled with whispers or laughter. It was filled with watchful stillness, every man in the lobby aware that something meaningful was unfolding. At the far end of the lobby, Captain Reyes entered, his boots striking softly against the tile. His uniform was crisp once more, his posture unshaken. He carried no weapons, only his presence, which filled the room with quiet authority. The crowd shifted unconsciously as he passed, giving him space without being asked. Reyes walked directly to lane 1, where Harold had already set down his bag. He did not command attention. He did not address the room. He simply moved beside the old man, placing his own gear on the bench. His presence was enough. Together they prepared their stations, silent and steady, the weight of brotherhood binding them without need for words. The sergeant stood a few paces back, watching. His chest rose and fell in measured rhythm, his lips pressed tightly.
He had been directed into disciplinary measures, tasked with assisting Harold whenever he came to the range. The assignment was not meant to punish, but to teach. Every moment spent observing the quiet dignity of the man he had once tried to humiliate chipped away at his arrogance, leaving respect in its place. The younger men who had mocked before lingered near the back, their rifles in hand. But they no longer whispered or laughed. They watched,
their eyes fixed on Harold's steady hands as he adjusted his target, as he aligned his stance. They saw not an old man, but a Marine who had once stood at Incheon, whose silence carried the weight of survival. When Harold raised his rifle, the room grew even quieter. Each breath he took seemed to set the rhythm for everyone watching. The shot rang out, sharp and clean, echoing through the lanes. The target shuddered, a hole carved neatly through its center. A few men exchanged glances, their eyes wide with respect. No one spoke. The silence itself was the applause. Reyes followed, lifting his rifle with precision, his shot landing just beside Harold's. He lowered the weapon, glancing briefly at the older man. Harold turned his head slightly, and their eyes met once more. The acknowledgement was brief but profound, the bond of men bound not by age, but by service. The sergeant stepped forward quietly, retrieving Harold's spent casing from the floor. He placed it gently on the bench beside the old man's bag, his hand steady, his eyes lowered. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it carried the weight of change. He was no longer the man who barked commands for power. He was learning what respect truly meant. As the session went on, the ritual deepened. Lane 1 was no longer just another spot at the range. It had become something else, a place of remembrance, a place of honor. The shooters who came did not claim it casually. They watched Harold stand there, and they understood. The tradition had been born, not written on a plaque, but etched in silence and dignity. When Harold finally packed his bag, his movement slow but deliberate, the room watched quietly. He lifted the cracked handle into his palm, his thumb brushing the seam once more. The ritual was complete, but it no longer felt like a lonely act. He walked out with the Marine captain at his side, and every head in the lobby turned slightly in acknowledgement. The sergeant remained at the counter, his shoulders squared, his face still. He did not speak as Harold passed. He simply raised his hand in a quiet gesture of respect, the kind that needed no words. Harold's cap tilted slightly in return, the faintest acknowledgement of a man beginning to learn what he had once forgotten. As the doors closed behind them, the silence lingered. It was not the silence of fear, nor the silence of humiliation. It was the silence of reverence, the kind that grows when tradition is reforged in the simplest of acts. A nod, a gesture, a salute. And so Lane 1 remained, not officially marked, not proclaimed in ceremony, but known by all who came. It belonged to Harold Benton, and through him, to every man who had carried the weight of sacrifice without asking for recognition. A tradition born not of words, but of silence. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.